Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Today we're going to talk about Photoshop's newest update, 24.5. It's the May 2023 release. And I'm going to speak a little bit more specifically about its value to wildlife photographers right after this. The latest update for Photoshop has been out for a little over a week. I'm not going to be the first one to get to this. What I do like to do is try to play with it a little bit, watch some other YouTube videos, and then really parse the information out there for my audience, which is wildlife photographers. Now, if you're not a wildlife photographer, you can watch this video. I'm glad to have you aboard. There's a subscribe button down there. But one thing I will tell you is I generally try to cater my content for my audience. And I think that's really one of the values that I try to bring to this channel is getting through all of that information that's out there, weeding it out for you, and then as a wildlife photographer saying, here's what you really need to know, or here's what you really might find useful. So when we get to this newest version, this 24.5, I'm going to show you 3 or 4 new features, but I'm going to spend a lot of time on one particular feature. I will tell you, it is May. The weather's been beautiful. I've been doing a lot of gardening outside and just spending a lot of time with birds. This is a part-time job for me, a side hustle, if you will. So I have a full-time commitment outside of YouTube and wildlife. So May is a really tough month for me to produce content, but I'm glad I'm able to bring you this video, and let's jump right in. Now, as we jump right in and you're looking at my screen, I'm going to just explain how my layout looks. Right underneath my head where I'm talking, you're going to see an adjustment panel. We're going to talk a little bit about that because there are some changes to that. Underneath that, you're going to see a layers menu. That's a very common layout for photography in Photoshop. On the left-hand side is where my toolbar menu is, and we are going to talk about that. So just take a note of that. I will slide that out to make it a little bit easier. And then you're also going to notice, if you've been using Photoshop and you just updated this, you're going to notice this little bar at the bottom. That's called the Contextual taskbar. We're going to talk about that specifically. But I want to start with a tool called the Remove tool. And imagine if in 30 seconds you could cleanly remove an object and have Photoshop actually fill it in a little bit around the edges and make it perfect. Let me show you what I was able to do in probably 30 seconds. Using the Remove tool, I was able to get rid of this branch and have Photoshop fill it in very cleanly without taking the time to meticulously clone or heal around this branch. This is a very powerful tool. Now, this is by far the most powerful tool for the wildlife photographer. I'm going to spend a lot more time on this at the end. To introduce it, it's going to be over on the left-hand side. I'm just going to pull my toolbar out here. It's going to be about halfway down. And if it's not there, I just want to let everybody know, you can find options for this down at the bottom. So where the 3 little dots are, if you hit that menu icon and you're not seeing the Remove tool where it should be or where it is on my menu, and you hit those, you get the option to edit the toolbar, and you're going to want to poke around in there and see where it's at. You can restore defaults to try to get it to come back, or you may have it listed on the right-hand side under Extra Tools, and you may have to drag it over to where your current toolbar is. So if you're not seeing it, try to reset that to the defaults, and that should help you out. Now we're going to spend more time on the Remove tool, and then I'm going to show you a lot of comparisons because I think this is the most powerful tool for the wildlife photographer. I'm going to do that at the end of the video, though. I want to get through a couple of these other changes and updates first. The first one I want to show you is just the cosmetic change, and the one that you're going to see right away is what's called the Contextual toolbar. And it's an interesting name, but it makes a lot of sense. The Contextual toolbar works within the context of what you are doing. So when you open your image, what you're probably going to see is this default that says select subject and remove background. There's also a couple other adjustments here. So you can create and add to this some adjustment layers right from the toolbar. If you change what you're doing, the Contextual toolbar changes. So for example, I'm going to quickly do a lasso selection of this bird. I'm going to make a real loose selection. And what the Contextual toolbar is going to do is follow the selection. Notice the toolbar actually moved, and it's going to change the options to include things like what you would normally do with a selection: smooth the borders, expand the selection, contract the selection, etc. So it almost predictively senses what you're doing and moves on to the next task. So it takes that menu that you would typically go to up top and it brings it right to where you're working. So from a workflow standpoint, this can be a little bit more efficient. It takes a little bit to get used to. I'll be honest, the first few days I was using it, this thing was floating around a little bit. If that's not for you, or if it takes a while to get used to, you can hit the menu options with the three dots, and you can actually pin it to a specific location. So if you just want to leave it down at the bottom, which is what I'll do for the rest of this video, you can just pin it to the bottom. If you make another selection and you go to a different menu, it's going to revert to a new set of contextual options. So again, it's using the context of what you're doing currently and changing that little toolbar to follow along with your workflow. So pretty neat tool. Second thing I wanted to show you today was just under the adjustment layers. So if you're in here, you're going to have this new set of presets. So if I hide the presets, typically what we've seen are what they're now calling individual adjustments. And you can make your adjustments to exposure, you can make your adjustments to saturation, typical things that we've done in the past. They've added some presets. Now I will tell you, I want to focus on what's important to wildlife photographers. I don't think this is going to be a big deal to you, but I will show you how it works. You're simply going to go into, I'm going to click more. There's a lot of different options here. I'm going to choose black and white. This is one that I could use as a wildlife photographer. And all it does is quickly make an adjustment layer based off of this feature, in this case, black and white. But if I wanted to do something a little more artistic, I could make it a little more artistic. In that adjustment layer, it's created a mask, so we can use the mask if we want, and we can also refine it a little bit more. So if we didn't like the exact way that this one looks, it gives us the ability to quickly change it. So for here, I'm just moving the black point a little bit. So those adjustments are nice. Again, as a wildlife photographer, not sure it's the most important thing to me, but it's a little panel that you will see. And if you don't want it, you can just collapse it upon itself and just work off of those original adjustments. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. All right. The third change that I wanted to talk about today was just to the gradient filter. And this is a really nice change. Not one, again, that wildlife photographers use a lot, but I will show a practical example of how I could use this. I'm going to go to the gradient selection, and then at the top, there's a bunch of presets. I'm just going to pick a random one. I'm just going to pick this color that's going to go from pink to blue, and I'm going to create a solid gradient across here. So I'm just making a new layer. Now I've selected the radial gradient, and I'm making that selection at the top. I could change that to a linear gradient. And this is where it's different than it was in the past. You'll notice now I have the ability to actually see the gradient and interact with it. So it's a little different interface. I can change how this gradient fades from left to right, and I can bring it closer or further away. And it's very easy to do. The interesting thing is if I go off of the gradient to a different layer, and then I go back to the gradient, it will pop back up to where I left it, or where I left off with that tool. Now, I don't typically use this style. There may be some people artistically that would want to. You could overlay this or use a soft light approach to get these artistic effects, almost like a color grading. But not, again, not a lot of wildlife photographers would do this, and it's not something that I typically do. Where I would use this tool, as I get rid of this one, I'm going to delete that layer. Here we go. I might, though, create a curve adjust layer or an exposure adjustment. And in that exposure adjustment, I might not want to apply it evenly across the image. So here, I brighten the image, or I raise the luminance. And I've got a mask over here that I could now use the gradient tool to interact with the mask instead. So I'm going to change this gradient up at the top to go from black to white, or white to black. And I'm now going to use this gradient as a mask. So notice I've put the brighter part of the image to the darker part. And you can see the colors actually right there. So you could see the black and the white. And because I'm doing this as a mask, I'm only working in black and white, and I'm fading that light. Now, typically I would bring in light something like this. So here's a good example for a wildlife photographer, a practical example. And then this gives me the option to fade that light in as I choose and do it right here on the screen without any other interfaces. Now, I would typically do this in Camera Raw, and I am going to show you why I prefer Camera Raw. I'm going to bring up the radial gradient, for example, and you're going to notice this is a circle. And while I can change the circle size, I can't alter the shape of the circle, at least not yet. And if you know how to, let me know. You could transform this. So in other words, I could go to the mask and actually stretch it using the transform tool, but we're starting to take away from the ease of use of what this tool is intended to be and what this update does, which is to make things a little simpler in terms of using the gradient tool. Now, where I prefer to do this, and I'll go ahead and delete this adjustment real quick. Where I prefer to do this is the really powerful camera raw. So I'll use the camera raw filter a lot in my workflow. I think it's the most powerful tool in Photoshop. I love the camera raw filter. And I'll show you the one difference between the filter in Photoshop that we just used and the camera raw filter. I'm going to choose the radial gradient. I'm going to make my circle, but it's not really a circle. I can make it an ellipse. And that's really what I like about this one. I can change directions and size without being locked into a circle. If I'm wrong on that radial filter in Photoshop and you can manipulate the size without transforming it, let me know, but I have not found a reason to do that or a way to do that. So again, I can adjust this here and then I can make that same little change in exposure to light here. So that's my preferred way to do it. But again, I think it's a nice touch what they did with the radial gradient and the linear gradient. I should say the gradient tool in general. Now, in the beginning of the video, I showed you how I real quickly removed a branch in less than 30 seconds. I'm going to show you a couple of tips and tricks around this as I've been working with it over the last week. Now, the remove tool is going to be located in your toolbar, and I've floated this out just to make it a little more obvious for you. And if I click here, you're going to see all of those healing tools that have been available for a long time, along with the new one, remove. Now, remove works very simply. It's a brush. So I'm going to select a layer here to work with. And as you click, and I'll just do one of the leaves first. As you click over it, you'll see the default is purple, and that's it. I highlight it, I take my finger off, it recalculates it. I'm going to zoom in here and show you one of the benefits is it does a really nice job matching like the noise patterns that are already existing in the image. When you clone and you use the clone tool, which is kind of my historic way of doing some of this, sometimes you're using a soft brush, you would get these little edges. So I wasn't a huge fan of that. Also to note, there's an option up here to remove after each stroke, and that's what I've chosen now. So as I click this and release the button, the mouse, it automatically does it. So you see my hands, it automatically did that. If I uncheck that, so if I'm doing a lot of little removals, it will only do it when I hit the check bar up at the top. So you notice, no hands, you see it's still purple. I'm going to go ahead and remove these two leaves, and I can change the size of this brush, but I've done two selections, and now I'll hit the check bar, and now it's going to recalculate. I'm going to default back to remove after each stroke over here for the remainder of this. I'm going to start from a fresh layer, and we're going to see how this works. Now, I will tell you, you will get mixed results. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see and be a little bit more detailed, but you do get mixed results with this. If you start big, sometimes you're going to get a result you may not like. So I'm going to click on the layer. I'm just going to select as much of this branch as I can. The more purple that you see, the more it's going to try to replace. This works a lot like delete and fill in the previous versions of Photoshop. Boy, that did a pretty good job. All right, it actually did a much better job than I expected. What I have noticed sometimes is when I try to do a lot at once, it may throw in weird stuff. You are going to have to play with this. It left a little bit there, and you could see between here and here, the transition wasn't great. Let's just try it right over that area and see if it's smooth, and it did. It smoothed it out. If there's an odd transition of color, you can also just fill in the colors. So there I had a kind of an odd transition. I'm going to see if this will blend that out and smooth it out. So it's going to remove it, and then it's actually going to replace it. So you can see how it's working there. So really not a bad job at all in terms of removal and replace. Let's compare this. I'm going to save that layer. And you notice how quickly I did that. So I'm going to just rename this layer remove. And let's compare this to some other ways that in the past that we could have done this. Let's look at one of the other healing options. So let's take a look at the spot healing brush tool. Now the spot healing brush tool, I use a long time, and I've used it typically for little distractions, little grains of sand, little feathers, something that wasn't as large as this. I can't imagine this is going to be the greatest tool in the world, but let's give it a shot. I'm going to try to just remove a leaf first, and we'll see how it does with a small object. We're already off to a pretty rough start. And I've got this feathered brush, so I may have to select a little bit more around it. That one's not too bad. But what happens when I get into these areas where the leaf is over the brush or over the branch? You can see it's a little rougher. And what happens if I try to do a lot at one time? What happens? I'll make this brush a little bit harder, but what happens if I select a lot of this? Is it going to get all of that right? I'm not even going to include the bottom. Oof. So you could see pretty rough. I don't have a lot of control or flexibility over this. This works a little bit like the remove tool in that I just select an area and let it go. But it's not always going to give me the best result. Let me take a look at another way we could probably try to do this. That would be something like the object select tool and using something like content aware fill, or I mentioned or referenced earlier, delete and fill. And delete and fill in my past videos has been the better of those options. So I'm just going to make a rough selection here. Let's see if it selects the object correctly. One tip if you're using object selection is expand the border. And notice that, here's that contextual toolbar. Look what it gives me the option to do right here. I can expand the selection. I'm going to expand it by 10 pixels. This will get me off the edges. If I stay close to those edges and I do this, I will often get a very different result. Now, I don't have the flower selected here, so I can add that in. I'm going to hold the shift bar and see if I can add that selection in. And I don't really want this branch, so I'm going to now hold the Alt key. Let me just hold the Alt key real quick. Oh, there we go. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm actually going to remove part of this selection. So you can already see it's a little bit more cumbersome because I've got to get the object that I want selected. And all right, I've spent enough time. Let's just give it a shot. I'm going to right click here and delete and fill the section. Let's see what happens. I have never spoken with anybody at Photoshop. I don't know who designs these things or how they work all the time. What I will tell you, let me go on I'm on the wrong layer. Here we go. What I will tell you is that the new remove tool seems to work a lot like delete and fill, but it doesn't end up doing weird stuff like delete and fill does. Delete and fill is using a lot of context around where you're working in, and it can be amazing and it can be a train wreck like this. Now, I bet you if I took a smaller selection, like just the leaf, and I'm doing this as an object select, you don't have to. I'll show you in a second how you can do it differently. And I did delete and fill on that leaf. There, it does a really good job. I can do this with the lasso tool, by the way. So I could just pick a leaf with the lasso tool, and I could also delete and fill. And that does a pretty good job. And let's look at content aware fill. That's another option we've had in the past. And I can just hit content aware fill. This gives me a little more flexibility in that I get to choose the area that it's going to select from. I'll remove some of this, and it's giving me a preview over here. So content aware, still a powerful tool, still a good tool. But is any of this as easy as that remove tool? I mean, my goodness. Let's try, here's one. Let's try a lasso selection, and let's see what content aware would do if I tried to get rid of this. That's about as long as it would take me with the remove tool to make the selection. Let's see what it does. Content aware fill. You could see the preview panel. It's just not going to work. It's just not giving me what I need. So I will tell you this. I'll cancel this out. Based off of what I have seen and worked with over the last couple months, or last couple weeks, the remove tool is extremely powerful. And it's fairly accurate most of the time. There are times when you're going to have to play around. It's not going to be perfect every time. I'm going to find that remove tool again. And I'm just going to make a selection here of some small leaves. And sometimes it's just not going to get it right. Again, this is all artificial intelligence. So it's all searching and finding and predicting what you want to do. I'm telling it to remove just the leaf, and you can see here, not a great job, even on the edge of the branch. Sometimes it's going to nail it and sometimes it's not. The convenience is, look how easy I can fix it. I can just keep going back to this little brush, and with just brush strokes and letting it go, it's going to make a very good predictive analysis. And normally it's going to get it really close. So it may take a few strokes. I may have to do it a couple times and I may have to refine it a few times, but the fill that it does is really, really, really good. So you could see just a few more brush strokes and I've got that whole thing completed. I couldn't do that with any of the other heel brushes, and I couldn't do that with things like content aware fill or even delete and fill. So those are the basic changes to Photoshop for May 2023, version 24.5. The most powerful tool in there, the remove tool. If you have any questions down in the comments, let me know. What are you seeing? Are you excited about the changes? Do you like the contextual taskbar? Put that down in the comments. And did I miss something? Is there a powerful use of this for wildlife photography specifically that I didn't cover? If I missed it, make sure you get it down in the comments. We'll have people read through there and maybe they can get some tips and tricks as well. If you're not subscribed to the channel, little button down there, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell for notifications. I only release videos every couple of weeks right now. I am very busy, so maybe 2 a month is what you're going to get. Not a ton of notifications, but I do want you to know when I have a new video out. I've got some exciting content coming up in the future, as well as some product reviews. So stay tuned for those. As always, I appreciate your support on the channel, and I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.